Hello, friend. This is Legal Design Thinking in Real Life live series provided by Lawyers Design School. I'm your host, Hannele Korhonen, and I'm the founder of Lawyers Design School. Today, I'm here with a very interesting guest, Chris Simkins, to talk about L2L contracts and contract design. Chris is a commercial lawyer, head of contract optimization at Simmons Simmons, that is a global law firm. And he says that he's passionate about trying to find ways to cut through the noise and simplify contracts, how contracts are created, agreed, and managed. It would be so interesting to hear more about contract design from this perspective. Hello, Chris, and welcome.
Hi, Hannele. Thanks for having me. I'm really delighted to join you.
Great. Where are you today? Where are you joining us?
So I live in Sheffield in the UK. And I work from home most of my week, but I also go down to London every week to spend time with my colleagues at Simmons Simmons.
Oh, perfect. And if you're watching this live, you can join the discussion by adding your questions and comments in the chat. But let's start. I'd like to start with your own background and story. Can you tell us something about yourself and your journey so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a commercial and technology lawyer by background and still am, really. I think like lots of lawyers, I trained in a big law firm and qualified in a big law firm and was working in intellectual property, commercial technology, transactional work. And then I went in-house. So I spent probably the biggest chunk of my career as an in-house lawyer doing commercial outsourcing, that sort of thing, in the UK with some big household names like Royal Mail and part of the BT group. And then I guess a real pivot for me came when I took the leap to join what was then a small consultancy called Wavelength that did a range of things like legal operations consulting. They were also a regulated law firm at the time, so I continued to do commercial law. But it was an opportunity for me to get involved in lots of the conversations around legal operations, process improvement, and so on. I joined that company when it was small, and then it was actually acquired by Simmons Simmons a few months after I joined. So I wasn't expecting to end up back in a law firm. It wasn't part of my plan at the time, but actually it's been a really interesting curveball because it's enabled me to do what I enjoy and kind of specialize more and more on contract, what I call contract optimization and contract design and all that world within the context of a global law firm, which is quite unusual, and we might come on to that. But for me, it's been a really positive thing. So that's how I've ended up where I am.
Oh, interesting journey and looking at the industry and also contracts from many points of view. How did you find design or contract design in the first place?
So it's something that I've been quite involved in the community around legal operations, legal design, lots of the time from the sidelines, really. So I've been aware of it happening, engaged with World CC and lots of that. It's something that I've got closer to over time as I've had the opportunity to start focusing on what I'm really interested in, which is helping businesses and clients simplify and improve their contract templates. I mean, what's interesting is that I think for me, the biggest motivation has always been because I was always very much a transactional lawyer doing negotiations and getting frustrated by the process and frustrated by the same old debates. And my journey into trying to improve contracts has come about from less a pure design angle and more how can we just introduce more balance into these contracts? How can we simplify it? If that makes sense. And then increasingly, so I've come at it from that angle, and increasingly that has overlapped with the world of legal design and contract design. So now a lot of what I do would be what lots of people might describe as contract design or legal design, but I probably came at it from a slightly different angle.
I think it's so interesting that we have these like parallel bubbles that people are doing the same thing but using different names, and then when the bubbles somehow come across, then you find all these new people. Oh, they are doing what I'm doing, and they just have a different name for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it really helpful to adopting the language and the learning that's come out of the legal design community has been really helpful to explain and I guess also just develop our own ways of delivering projects. I think before I might not have had a language to talk about this stuff, but you still had this innate sense that we could be simplifying, we could be redesigning, we could be doing this in a better way. So it's been a really nice, I think, to be able to build on each other's ways of looking at the world.
Exactly. Hey, besides your day job, you also write a blog, Improving Contracts. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's relatively new. So anyone who's actually looked at the blog will notice that I don't post very often. I'd like to do it more than I do. It really just came about because I've got lots of ideas. I've still got a long list of ideas of things that I would like to write about coming out of my work and the things I've done. And really, a blog is a great way to do that. It means that I can talk about things. And I suppose the power of having a personal blog is that I can write about things that interest me. Anyone who works in a big organization or a law firm will know that sometimes it can be difficult to get approval for certain things or to write in a certain way. Whereas having my own blog is just a space where I can share ideas in my own voice about things that interest me at my own pace. So at the moment, there's 4 or 5 blog posts up there. Despite my best efforts, they've all become quite long. But in future, I'm hoping to write some that are a bit more punchy.
I think we all need a creative outlet, and blog is perfect creative outlet for anyone looking for a place to write.
Yeah.
But your blog is brilliant, and that is actually how we connected, because you, in one of your blog posts, you introduced this very interesting concept of L2L contracts, and I'm so curious to learn more from you. What do you mean by L2L contracts, and how did you come up with this concept?
Yeah, so it came about. L2L stands for lawyer to lawyer contracts, and it was partly me building on the idea of B2B and B2C contracts. So I'm sure to everyone listening, they'll be familiar with those concepts. We often break down contracts into thinking about B2C and B2B. And I had this moment, this kind of light bulb moment, when I realized that so much of what I do now is about focusing on mostly B2B contracts, but trying to take contracts that are probably designed by lawyers for lawyers, and turning into something where the contract can be used and it becomes familiar to people that aren't lawyers. And obviously in the B2C world, there's lots of focus on trying to make terms and conditions and contracts accessible and understandable and all that sort of thing. But then this light bulb moment came when I was dealing with a colleague who still operated in a world where all the contracts that they were dealt with were always just dealt with by lawyers. If you work in the world of corporate M&A or project finance or probably real estate, lots of areas, it's still very much the case that it will be lawyers who are responsible for dealing with the contract documents. So in that world, it's quite helpful to think about those, I thought, as lawyer to lawyer contracts, because it's not businesses or business people as such without legal training. It's actually lawyers. And I just found that idea becomes quite useful to think about a few different things. One is that as a community, if we're trying to change the way we focus on consumer contracts or contracts for those that don't have legal training, but we know that there's other types of contract that still exist where it's all exclusively pretty much run by lawyers, the way in which there's going to be like this divergence. It might be slow, pace might pick up, but there's going to be a divergence in practice and a way of thinking about it, and that's already happening. And I think there's some interesting things that will flow from that. I think some people took the article as a kind of a defense of the old traditional style of lawyering. It really wasn't intended to be that. And given my day job, you could probably imagine that I have no intention of defending legalese or the traditional way of doing contracts. It was more hopefully a way of just observing how some things are and then giving us a language to talk about it. And the key thing, I think, is just a bit of a shift to think about the people who are actually involved in running the contracts rather than thinking about organizations or entities, because in the end it's always people and it's humans that are dealing with this day to day.
For sure. And I think it's so, yeah, it was a light bulb for me too, reading your blog, and it was so nice to also find new language around explaining, because of course lawyers are also for B2C and B2B contracts, lawyers are one user group for those contracts as well, but then there are contracts who are mainly read and used by lawyers only. If you think about how those contracts are then drafted and managed, if they are L2L contracts, what are the differences between B2B and B2C and then L2L contracts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things I bring out in the blog is that so much of how we traditionally have written contracts and how that they still currently look is based on, there's lots of practical things. You know, people don't have the time for individual transactions to rewrite contracts from scratch every time. So you have to reuse, that is part of life. And once you start reusing, that's how, you know, a traditional way of doing things becomes embedded, and that's how lawyers learn. In a way, I think lots of the movement now to try and simplify and improve contracts is saying, actually, no, we're going to try and start again, and think about how would we create these contracts if we were starting from a blank page. And with specific users in mind. And one thing you realize when you start doing that is that actually contracts aren't just one thing. Contracts are often doing multiple things at the same time. And that's where the challenge often lies. So in the L2L culture, you know, a contract would typically be one long document. It might have front-end terms and it might have a long list of schedules, but everything has to crystallize in this one document that lawyers control. Whereas I think lots of, you know, practically what I do day to day now is thinking about the different elements that are going into a contract, breaking it down and thinking which bits of this really do need a lawyer's involvement, if at all, which of these can be, you know, people can run without any legal training, or our commercial colleagues can complete and negotiate, and putting all of that in, factoring that into how we create the templates and how we create our contracts. So that's just a different mindset, but it raises lots of practical challenges in the real, I was going to say in the real world, but in the kind of day-to-day business to business law firm environment where people are just having to do lots of transactions every day. They can't, and they do have to reuse content. We can't turn every single contract into an artisan piece of art. And how do you achieve that is something we're all wrestling with, I think.
For sure. Something that just came up, this made me think of cultural differences. Since you are working, are you mainly working with UK contracts, or are you looking at some other more international contracts as well? And do you see any differences in those contexts in terms of L2L contracts or contracts in general?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, most of the contracts that I would be involved with are things that are kind of UK based or governed by English law. Although it's quite common to be working on, you know, especially for larger groups of templates that a client might want to be able to use in different jurisdictions. And again, that's something you have to manage with in terms of how you try and do that in a simple way to deal with local law challenges. So I suppose I probably am biased to kind of that English law, common law style. What I think what's interesting is quite often when you have to go to lawyers around the world and get their input into something we might have created, does this work in your jurisdiction? It's amazing how little needs to change a lot of the time. And traditionally, it's probably the English law or US law style contracts are the ones that are the longest and have all the, you know, unnecessary words in them. And civil law jurisdictions are generally, you know, thought of as being shorter and more to the point anyway. So if we're starting from a point of trying to make things simple and as short as they can be, we're probably moving our traditional common law jurisdiction, UK, US templates closer to perhaps what civil law jurisdictions are used to seeing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting discussion, because I've been hearing these comments that lawyers from common law countries like UK and US, you are more hesitant to change the language, and you need to stick with certain. Of course, we all do. We all have these specific expressions that come from legislation or whatever, but you are like more hesitant to change the language because you have the common law background. Do you think that's the case?
I think it probably is. I mean, I think this is probably one of the biggest sticking points for why traditional contracts are the way they are, and it's really hard. And I feel this every day in my day job. It's really hard to make decisions, especially when you're making decisions on behalf of your clients, kind of effectively, to take things out. You know, it's always easier to keep things as they are, or to assume there's a reason why they're there. And I think it's just, that's part of our makeup as humans, to say, you know, I'm not quite sure why that's there. I'm sure someone put it there for a good reason. The path of least resistance is always going to be to keep it there. And even from a professional point of view, it is quite challenging. So I had the situation a couple of weeks ago, and probably almost for the first time, I had a client saying, I think you've gone too far. That's too simple. Can you put something back in? Now, for that conversation to be happening this way round, for a client to be telling someone in a big law firm, you've gone too
I think
simple.
that's a win.
Yeah, right. So on the one hand, it's a win, but it was a really interesting process to go through, because it made me reflect that when people say that to you, if the accusation is, oh, you've put something too much in, please can you take it out? You're not being commercial, please can you take it out? All those sorts of things we're used to saying. It's easy to take that as a criticism, because you can say, well, okay, I was just, if that's how you feel comfortable as a business or a client, that's fine. If someone's saying you've gone too far, you need to put, why is this not in? Can you put it back in, please? That feels like, it almost feels like it's bordering on accusing you of negligence as a lawyer, right? So the whole conversation, the whole dynamic is hard, and that's why these conversations are always hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because there's no right answer a lot of the time. There are some bits of contracts where you can be fairly clear based on your legal experience or case law that some things need to be dealt with in a certain way. But so much of what goes into contracts isn't about whether or not it is the right answer as to whether or not it should go in. It's about the context and about how comfortable you are about with risk, and so, which makes it hard to justify your decisions sometimes as well, apart from just saying, my experience tells me that you don't need it, or it's probably not worth it. So yeah, it's difficult.
But this kind of discussion is so interesting than just going back and forth, that we need to have it and we don't, like, it's either or black and white, and typically it's just to be on the safe side. Let's just keep everything as it is, so that we don't take any unnecessary risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the benefits of having been, worked as an in-house lawyer for a number of years. I think there's a reason that probably some of these conversations are being pushed by those who do work in-house or have worked in-house, because external law firms by their nature tend to get brought into the slightly more and larger scale or out of the ordinary transactions. But if you work in-house, you know that there's just that the majority of contracting happens in the middle, right? It's routine contracting, and you're dealing with issues day to day, and that's quite hard to see externally, or to necessarily feel in a tangible way what impact having a simplified template can have on that process. So much of my experience is probably driven by that, but also just the power of, if you've dealt with a few contract disputes that have been resolved commercially and haven't got anywhere near court, or even if they have got near court, but you realise that actually the contract didn't have much bearing on how that was resolved in the end. It really starts to change your view about what risk looks like in a contract, and and that sort of stuff's hard to teach. Like it kind of comes by osmosis and by through experience, I suppose. But it's helpful that we can all just build on our language and our case studies and how we can describe these things.
For sure. Hey, talking about case studies, would you be able to share something about your approach to design work and maybe some samples, redesigned samples?
Yeah. So you mentioned about kind of sharing examples of work.
Yeah.
Obviously, for obvious reasons, it's kind of difficult for me to bring up live client jobs, but I have got some slides that I sometimes share that kind of give a flavour of the sorts of things we do and how we approach projects. So let me just share my screen and hopefully this will work. So can you...
Yes, I can see it. Oh, no, it disappeared again.
Oh. Can you see my slides?
I just see your face. I don't see your slides, no.
Oh, let me try that one more. Let me try that again. Apologies if that...
Okay, let's try. Okay, now, yes.
That's working.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I'll just whip through these. I'm sure some of this kind of language will be familiar to your audience, but obviously when we're working with clients who, and one of the interesting things about working in a law firm is that our clients don't necessarily come to us thinking about legal design or thinking about this stuff, which is why the conversation can start in a different place. And so sometimes talk about some of these ideas to try and set the scene for our clients. And a key one for me, this is actually kind of comes out one of my blog posts that I was talking about different types of people involved in contract improvement, and talked about those who focus on drafting and some of those focus on design and those who focus on digitization. And I think of those as kind of the dimensions through which I see lots of the work I do. So here we've got drafting, what does the contract need to say, what should it say, and how is it written? And then there's all the various aspects of design, but particularly kind of how is the content structured and how is it presented to make it usable. And then nowadays, increasingly a big driver is digitization as well. And sometimes the projects that we get involved with are people who are wanting to automate contracts. They're not necessarily coming to us thinking about legal design. They're thinking about technology and contract management platforms and automation. And then they realize that they need to do something to their templates to be able to do that. Let's get forward. This is just another way, and just another slide really to capture that same idea around drafting, design, and digitization all being different dimensions to contract improvement. But the reason I present this in this way is I think I hold this quite loosely, but as an idea, I tend to think of that kind of the drafting and the core content as being optimizing for purpose, and that can mean different things. Contracts are about relationships. They're obviously about the commercial details. They're about managing risk. They're about compliance and probably other things as well. But in the end, the core content and what you write has to address those things, and you can optimize for that. And then how you then turn that into something that is usable for humans, I think that's a key part of the design element. And as I've said, optimizing for systems and technology is a key aspect of digitization, and all those things overlap. So I would hold that lightly, and I wouldn't say that one is more important than the other. But I just think it's, again, another useful language through which to talk about these things. And then in terms of just the process, again, this will be familiar to people. We broadly try and think about redesigning a set of templates, particularly when we're doing kind of a larger project rather than a standalone set of terms. Going through this process, kind of a service design type mindset of starting with discovery, not starting with your existing template, but starting with what you're trying to achieve, who's involved, capturing requirements, understanding technology constraints, all those sorts of things before you move into a design phase, and planning what you're actually going to do as an output and getting into delivery. And then the next thing if I was zooming in then and we start to create content, I often try and follow this process and use this to explain to clients how I would think about the process. So again, starting with structure.
Can I ask about the discovery phase? Do clients already understand the value of like not jumping directly into the writing and drafting phase, but doing this discovery phase first?
Well, yeah, I guess one of the challenges of our work is that clients come to us with different mindsets. So some are fully on board with that. Some will be quite connected to the legal design or contract design kind of community, or at least will have heard about it, and that's their entry point, and they want to do that sort of thing. Others, naturally, lawyers get approached, and all firms get approached to look at terms and conditions and templates all the time anyway. And if people are coming with just a kind of a routine ask, sometimes it can be a harder conversation to say, well, let's start here, because they just want you to take the problem away from them and do it for you because they don't have the resource. That's the problem, right? So I guess the answer is it depends. But I think that there's so much talk now of the kind of service design and project delivery and so on that I think it's probably not as alien as it would have been once. But yeah, and I think working through this process is perhaps slightly more unusual, and it's also slightly more unusual for my colleagues, because I've been on a journey with the people I work with in the firm to get them to think about it in these terms. But contract architecture, thinking about where things should sit, often catching the different variables that need to go into a contract. This is particularly important if you're thinking about automation and that sort of thing. But if we're trying to capture the key commercial variables in a way that doesn't rely on lawyers, it's important to identify where they are, what they are early, so that can be factored into your design. And then the key one that I like to talk about and I find really useful is this concept of wireframing. So many of the problems that persist in contract drafting and contracts comes from always working with something that you've got before, something that's existing, and for all the reasons we've talked about, it's hard to pull yourself away from that. Whereas I try and instill this idea of starting from a blank page mindset. What needs to go in if we're starting from a blank page, and to work through that, to not start by launching in with writing detailed words of clauses, but to think about what, wireframing it in an outline sense of what content needs to go in and where should it sit, and doing that thinking before you then launch into a kind of a first full draft. And it kills a kind of an English phrase, but it kills multiple birds with one stone. I think it helps you confirm where some of the assumptions you've made early on, you can kind of confirm and test those assumptions in the wireframing process. And also it just helps you when you're thinking about formatting in design, you can start to build in some of those ideas at that stage. And then I've just got some samples to bring that to life. So when I talk about contract architecture, we quite often at the early stage talk about that you create contract architecture diagrams to visualize and plan where different content might go with clients. This sort of thing does feel quite unfamiliar to clients, I think. And sometimes it can be hard to actually picture and visualize what this means in practice if you're not used to thinking in these terms, which is why the wireframing can be useful as well. But this is an example of, looking at a whole suite of products and service terms for a client where their current setup was to have a traditional master services agreement, which had its front end and schedules. What they wanted to do is still have a kind of framework relationship with clients, but have more flexibility to introduce different services over time, to change the commercial terms of their services over time, to have multiple orders with clients over time, all that sort of thing. So, go through this process of, okay, practically what different elements of the contract should we create, who should own those, and that sort of thing. And, this is an example. I think this was version 2, because we did version 1, which I think illustrates how it's helpful to do this. And also, by the way, this becomes really useful to talking to your business colleagues about what you've done, and kind of almost feeds straight into the training pack when you finish the job. So that's contract architecture diagrams. This is an example of kind of what the wireframe looked like in this case. The level of detail in a wireframe can quite often varies depending on the circumstances. But what this is doing is it shows the kind of, I mean, this is anonymized, so it's different to the actual result, but it showed the kind of formatting and the styling we were proposing to build out for the client based on their branding. It shows the key sections that I've just shown up in the contract architecture diagram. In practice, these would end up being different documents, but for this point we were kind of wireframing, and you can see that we've just got to the level of detail of having key headings and key bits, so that we can think, yes, this should go here or that should go there. And often the hardest bit in all of this, by the way, is the kind of, it's not the front end terms, it's these kind of forms and pricing sheets and service order forms and all that sort of stuff. That's where you can have the biggest impact in terms of freeing up business colleagues to work without lawyers' input. But making all that talk to the rest of the contract terms and to work is can be the hardest thing. And this is just an example of something I've talked about before, and we've done in a few client agreements, is introduce the idea of guidance notes in the text. This is particularly useful, I think, when you've got something that needs to go in perhaps for a regulatory reason, or is specific to a client, but you know it might be unusual to a counterparty. This is something, and this is just one example we did where we were doing a project for a bank, and we were trying to work on a template that would be as mutual as possible because it was a partnership agreement, as balanced as possible. But suddenly you would hit areas where it couldn't be mutual because it was something that affected the bank and not the counterparty. So how do you overcome that in terms of trying to limit negotiation or limit questions? So, one thing we did is build in these ideas of branded guidance notes that would sit in the text and hopefully explain in relatively plain language why this clause is there, just to cut out the need for negotiation. And some of this stuff, it's not highly visualized design because it can't be, because we're working in Word and we're working with contract management automation platforms. So it's what can we do practically that will try and help with the human element of all this, but is practical and clear. I'll leave it there, and but hopefully that gives a flavour of kind of some of the things that actually come up in my day job and how we talk to clients and deliver projects.
Yes, thank you for sharing. That was really perfect to see the approach and also these examples. And I love your language around wireframe and this blank page approach, because that is also something that I use in my own workshops. And I see working with lawyers, it's so challenging if you just start redesigning what you already have. Like you are so attached to the text and you just like dive in and you can't see the forest from the trees. But then when you just kind of very simple shift that you just start from the blank page and try to understand that what are even the most important sections in this contract. Can you actually find some content that is not necessary at all to have in the contract, and questions like that you never really stop to think about when you are working with your existing templates.
It's probably the thing I bang on about the most to my colleagues, is this idea of blank page mindset, but it's not without its challenges. So because it's harder and slower. Okay, so we're all living in a real world where we've got to balance budgets and timescales and process and things. So sometimes I talk about blank page mindset rather than necessarily always starting from a blank page, because sometimes you're dealing with different contexts with clients. But the other challenging thing that can happen with contract optimization projects is that, and it's both their strength and their challenge, right, is that contracts are a place where lots of business issues, risk issues, compliance issues crystallize in a business's terms and conditions. Which means if you start taking your crystallized set of terms and conditions and start dissolving it, suddenly you can't. suddenly your dissolved stuff is running everywhere and you can't control it, and it opens a opens a bunch of cans of worms. And so one thing, if you really do want to go full scale and transform your terms and conditions, you need to be aware at the start of the process that that's going to prompt lots and lots of decisions. So you need to know who your decision makers are, and try and limit them if you can to people who are empowered to make decisions for you as you go. But also be prepared to take your business colleagues on the journey with you, whether or not that's salespeople, operational, delivery, finance, all those sorts of people that might need to input into the decision making, and say, right, you need to line those people up, because and it's amazing how common it is, and this is something that certainly was my experience when I was an in-house lawyer as well, is that what will start off as a project to reimagine your standard terms of business will then morph into discussions about what your business model is. Right? Because people will go, oh, and this is especially true in kind of the world of technology and licensing and that sort of stuff, where your core license does kind of reflect what your business model is. But it's quite common that even the kind of how you charge for things, or what your licensing model is, or your usage rights and all that sort of stuff, it's not just lawyers who just get stuck in how things are and don't quite understand why things are the way they are. It's the rest of the business colleagues as well. So suddenly you go, oh, maybe we should stop having so many complicated license models, and we should. So that it's a long way of saying that can be a challenge, but it's also the power of it. So contract terms and your standard templates are business documents and compliance documents. They're doing lots of things. That's why they're important, but it's also why you can have a massive impact by improving them.
For sure, and it's a very good example of the importance of getting the business users and other people from your organization to participate the project, because many times lawyers have this fear that they don't care, they don't want to come to the workshop with us to think about the pain points. But it's actually, for those users, it's actually thinking about their daily work, what they do every day, and it's super valuable for them to be able to have the impact in the contract as well, because then they are more aligned with it, and then maybe the change management process is much more easier because they have been involved from the beginning.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. But what are the results and impact with your clients when you do these kind of projects? What is the feedback?
It normally lands really well. Well, it depends. So the honest truth is that I think I've probably said this already, but lots of the projects I work on are on a scale, and they go from minor evolution through to full revolution. And as you'd imagine, the biggest impact tends to happen when you've had the opportunity to kind of start from a blank page and reimagine stuff. And it also depends a little bit on how bad the starting point was, right? But to give you a couple of examples, I mean, one of the kind of projects that really kicked off the opportunity to focus on contract optimization at the firm was where we were working with a client, a classic kind of technology client, who'd amassed a whole load of templates for about 4 key products. They'd ended up with something like 29 different versions for different scenarios. They were very traditional styles. There was inconsistency between them. And what that looked like for that client was that they relied on kind of an outsourced legal service to manage their contracts day to day. And they were spending, well into 6 figures a year just to kind of manage that. When I got involved, we just had to sort this out. So unfortunately, we had the kind of leeway to do that over a period of time. We consolidated them all down into essentially what was one document with a few different modules and variations. And as part of that, we tried to introduce balance, anticipate how it would land with counterparties and so on. And at the end of that, they basically did away with that external legal spend completely, because suddenly they had a document that they could, their license manager could just complete the key commercial deal terms in a front sheet, send it out, and it cut out all the aggro of generating these contracts in the first place, but also it pretty much removed the negotiation. So suddenly, so that's just a very tangible, direct business impact. I mean, another example is where working for a big bank who was doing a scheme where they wanted to contract with, they wanted to do kind of pop-up banking facilities in local facilities around the country. But lots of these people they were contracting with were kind of like church halls and local libraries and that sort of thing. And the best they could come up with from the lawyers in the team was, a standard services type agreement that was 36 pages long. And I get why that's the case, because the legal team don't have the bandwidth in that scenario to just kind of reimagine something that's bespoke. But we managed to, get a bit of budget to work to create something new, and we got something down to 3 sides of A4, written in plain language with a simple front sheet. And and the interesting thing is, really, we managed all the same risks in those terms in that scenario. So that's just two examples, but it can be the impact can be really dramatic, and also for legal teams, they can make themselves very popular internally with their internal stakeholders, because normally, it's their internal stakeholders in the business that kind of feel the frustrations with some of the way things are. So if you can take the lead on that sort of stuff and say, this is what we're going to do, then it lands really well.
Oh, it's so wonderful, because the ROI is so concrete and real. This is nothing fluffy, but it's real money that is saved.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But hey, before we go, I'd like to go back to your story and your path to working with contracts in this new way, because I know that it's not easy always. What has your own experience been like working in this new way?
So I feel very lucky, really. I think I'm not aware of anyone else approaching or doing what we're doing at Simmons Simmons in quite the same way that I'm doing it at the moment. That might be unfair. Do connect with me if you're doing it. I'd love to speak with you, but I'm not aware of this sort of work and these sorts of conversations being led out of a law firm, and I feel very fortunate. And most of it is unplanned and kind of from a slightly unusual sequence of events that meant I've been able to have those conversations within a law firm and kind of create my own role a little bit. So I feel very fortunate about that, and my colleagues have really got on board with it, and we're going through a learning process together of because the other reality of these things is that Simmons Simmons has got lots of clients. They've got lots of big clients. I'm one person, so you can't rely on me to deliver everything or write everything. So a challenge with all these things is how do you drive consistency? How do you marry up your rhetoric with what you're delivering? And I think it's about spreading skills and mindset and experience across the team so that we can do that, because I think it's quite difficult to think of a law firm and go, okay, well, you said that you deliver it in this way. Why isn't everything that's coming out of that law firm matching that? And the reality is that's not how it works. So that's a journey we're all on. But I don't know, that probably went slightly off your question there, but I hope that
no,
helps.
but you're in a happy place, but because you get to do this pioneer work. Is it challenging or is it frustrating?
Probably both. Like I say, I feel very. What's great now is I get to focus on it. It's pretty much my sole focus, and it's recognised as part of my role that I've got this kind of internal education piece. I'm very much, my primary thing is I work with clients, and I'm a kind of fee earner in the law firm language. But also, I've got it's kind of recognised that part of my role, I think, is around developing the area, developing skills internally, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm really that's great to be able to have that reflected in my role, because it's always going to be a challenge for lawyers in law firms who are focused full time on transactional work for clients to really be able to grab this stuff. And that's one of the reasons that there's a bit of inertia, and there will continue to be. So yeah. it's a mix of frustration and challenge, but also it feels really positive at the moment.
But I think it can also serve as an inspiration for other law firms that yes, you can implement this, and yes, you can do it, and just start doing it, even though you're not able to like do it in every corner of your office at the same time. You just need to start somewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
What would you say to someone who would like to get started using contract design in their work? What are your tips how to get started?
Yeah, so, well, I suppose contract design is, I mean, as you know, it's a whole load of different things. And for me, it's more of a mindset than it is. We can talk about the tools and the approaches and so on. But really, it's a mindset. And quite a lot of that mindset is having the confidence to kind of challenge and think about the way things are. So, you know, try and connect with the community. I think learn what you can, have these conversations and promote it. But also just in your everyday kind of work, I think if you can, you know, most lawyers, and this is true for myself, which is why I often feel like I have a big dollop of imposter syndrome. Like I've never been trained in how to draft in plain language. I'm kind of retrofitting that into my experience now by reading books and trying to back it up. But we're not trained in that stuff, but there are resources out there, and I think if you're interested, go and do it. The same, you know, brilliant resources out there like and the training you do. So that's probably a bit of a waffly answer, but I think it doesn't need to be big stuff. I think if you can take a lead especially if you're an in-house lawyer, lots of people want to do this stuff but don't get around to it. I think if you can just pioneer it, and if you know that there's just that one clause that causes unnecessary problems, just try and focus on simplifying that, or start a conversation about it internally. Because if you can take the initiative, lots of people want to do it but they won't get around to it, and if you're the one who takes the initiative, then there's lots of doors open to you, I think.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. Start with one clause and take the initiative. But hey, to end this conversation, tell people what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so I've got a pretty steady stream of client projects at the moment that range from, you know, the one-off slightly unusual templates to the, you know, reimagining a suite of templates. So that keeps me busy. I've got some more blogs in the pipeline so hopefully I will get some of those onto my blog soon. And also some of the, going back to the point we've just been talking about, you know, next week, for example, I'm running an internal session at Simmons around kind of contract drafting and things. So I'm busily trying to get myself ready for that.
Great. And where can people learn more about you, or even connect with you if they are interested in chatting with you?
Yeah, well, I guess the main thing is probably LinkedIn. So do connect with me on LinkedIn. It's been I've already found it a brilliant way to connect with people that I followed in this community. So do that. And obviously my blog, improvingcontracts.com. There's some stuff on there already, and hopefully some more in the not too distant future. Other than that, I'm sure you can find me via the Simmons Simmons website as well.
Great. Hey, thank you, Chris, so much for taking the time to be with me today and sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been so important and fun also.
Oh no, brilliant! It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.